sides together with the slanted edge of the front of your romper or dress. Sew in place using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Using a pair of scissors or nips, place a small clip above the top of the pocket. This clip should go all the way to, but not past, your stitching line. Grab the pocket bag piece. Place this right sides together with the front of your romper or dress. Pin in place along the straight edge. Once you get about halfway down the bodice, pin the bottom of the pocket bag to the bottom of the pocket facing. Continue pinning until you are on either side of the place where you made your snip. Flip your romper or dress over so that you are looking at it from the wrong side. This next part we need to pin very carefully. The snip that you made earlier cut into the seam allowance of your front bodice piece. We will use this to match up to the seam allowance on the outside seam of the pocket facing. This will create one smooth seam between the bodice and the pocket facing. This gives us a sharp turnout of our pocket. Sew along this edge, making sure to sew closely to where the two seam allowances meet. Let's take a look at how our sewn pockets match up. As you can see from the bottom of the pocket bag, there is a fluid stitching line. When we look underneath, the seam allowance from the pocket facing and main bodice meet sharply at the edge of our slant pocket. From the right side, we see the sharp lines of our slant pocket. Repeat for the other side and you're all done. Now we are going to sew our V-neck binding. First, let me note that your piece will look different than it does right here. We changed the neckline a bit in testing. We are going to now pin the right side center of the binding to the wrong side center of the front bodice piece. Pin along the neckline, stretching evenly as you go. Now that we have pinned all the way across, you are going to sew your binding in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure you pivot sharply at the V. Once you have sewn your binding in place, press the remainder of the binding upwards. Take a pair of scissors or nips and place a small clip in the V-neck. You can go all the way to your stitches, but don't go past them or you'll leave a hole. Now we are going to fold the top edge of our binding down 1/2 inch and then another 1/2 inch to completely enclose the raw edge. Pin your binding in place once you've folded it over and continue along the rest of the neckline. Once you have pinned all of your binding, we are going to secure by sewing the binding closed. If you are using a zigzag stitch, you can zigzag either 1/8 of an inch away from the binding to where all of your stitching is on your binding, or overlap it slightly onto the front bodice. Make sure you pivot sharply at the V-neck. Now you can see our binding is stitched in place. All that's left to do is to sew the V into our V-neck. Fold your bodice in half with right sides together and press well. What we are going to do is we are going to sew a small dart from the top of the binding to the seam. Do not go past the seam or you'll sew a pucker into the front of your garment. Now let's take a look at our binding. As you can see, I've used my sewing machine to create a small dart in the binding piece. This way, when the fabric is opened, you get that nice, clean, sharp V. Give your garment a good press and you're ready to go. We are ready to add our arm binding. As you can see on this romper, I've already added the arm binding to one side. All of my raw edges are nice and enclosed, and I have a little bit of exposed strap at the top. Start by grabbing your binding piece. Fold right sides together and sew into a loop. Press your seam allowance open. Now, using the chart in the tutorial, we are going to mark the placement for our front and back straps. Using a ruler, measure each strap length from your center seam. For the size 5 on the front binding, I'm going to measure 8.5 inches. I will add a pin here so I know that this is where my binding needs to stop on my bodice. I will do the same from the back and measure 11 inches from that seam. Now I have my front and back start and stop points marked, and the little bit in the center will be my exposed strap length. Turn your romper wrong side out. We will start by matching the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the fabric with the seam of your binding aligned with your side seam. Now we will take our back marker and match it to the top of our back bodice. Pin the binding to the romper. You will have to stretch slightly, and you want to concentrate most of your stretching on the bottom portion of your armhole. This is going to keep the sides of your romper from gapping out when worn. Repeat for the front part of the binding. Once you have pinned all of your binding, we are going to sew in place along the edge of the romper using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you have sewn your binding in place, press the remainder of the binding upwards. Now we are going to fold our binding over 1/2 inch and then another 1/2 inch to completely enclose the raw edges. Pin in place. Continue pinning along the front and back neckline. Use as many pins as you need to feel comfortable with your binding. The more pins you have, the less likely it is to slip while you are sewing. Once you get to the open strap at the top of your romper, you will want to fold each side over 1/2 inch towards the center. This portion of your binding will create the open strap that goes over the shoulder. Once you have all of your binding pinned in place, you are going to sew closed with a stretch stitch of your choice. I prefer a zigzag stitch all the way around the edge. Now let's take a look. As you can see, our binding has completely enclosed the raw edges. My personal preference for binding is to use a cotton lycra. This is a heavyweight custom cotton lycra that I find great for binding. It doesn't stretch or pull and gives such a nice finish. And that's it, friends. Thanks for sewing with me.